They saw a checkbook. I saw liabilities. At my retirement party, my family celebrated my betrayal, mistaking my silence for surrender. They had no idea I was about to turn their luxury lives into a survival horror with a single signature. Before we watch their world crumble, tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by those you trusted? Let's find out what happens when the bank finally closes. The sound of the manila envelope hitting the buttercream frosting of my retirement cake was louder than the applause had been moments earlier. I stood there, a 67-year-old man clutching a glass of lukewarm champagne, watching the woman I had supported for 4 decades announce to a room full of strangers that her parting gift to me was her freedom. Victoria wanted a divorce, and along with it, she wanted half my pension and the sprawling house in Connecticut, the air in the banquet hall, previously thick with the scent of stale perfume and ambitious greed, suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. My son, Daniel, clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of a seal waiting for a fish, while my daughter, Chloe, actually let out a cheer, raising her phone to ensure her live stream audience caught every pixel of my humiliation. My son-in-law, Justin, a man who couldn't sell ice in a desert, popped a confetti cannon, raining glitter down on me like debris from a collapsing building. They thought they had just won the lottery, but they had no idea they were dancing on a landmine. I simply wiped a smudge of blue icing off the legal documents, uncapped my fountain pen. The only luxury item I allowed myself, a gift from my father when I passed my CPA exam 40 years ago, and looked at the papers. Petition for dissolution of marriage. They had planned this down to the minute. They had orchestrated a public execution of my dignity, counting on my shame to force a quick, quiet settlement. Victoria looked at me, her eyes gleaming with a triumph she hadn't earned. She expected me to beg. She expected me to cry, eel, or cause a scene that would justify the villainous caricature she had painted of me to her country club friends. But I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I felt a cold, mathematical clarity. I looked at the legal papers and then at my family. I saw them not as my flesh and blood, but as liabilities, toxic assets that had depreciated to zero. Sign it, Stephen. Victoria hissed, leaning in close so only I could hear, her breath smelling of expensive Chardonnay. Don't make this difficult. I want half the brokerage accounts, the house, and alimony. My lawyer says we can drag this out until you are living in a cardboard box. Or you can sign and keep your dignity. Dignity. That was a rich word coming from a woman who had just turned my retirement party into a circus. I looked past her at Daniel, who was already on his phone, likely looking up the trade-in value of his leased sports car. He thought the bank of Dad was about to be broken open and looted. He had no idea that the bank had a security system he had never bothered to ask about. I signed my name, Stephen Edward Bennett, with a steady hand. The same hand that had signed billion-dollar merger contracts. As I handed the papers back to her, I leaned in and whispered 5 words that she should have listened to carefully. You just triggered the apocalypse. She laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound, dismissing me as a bitter old fool. Enjoy the party, Victoria, I said, capping my pen. You're paying for it. I turned to walk away, the confetti crunching under my dress shoes. I didn't look back at the banner that said Happy Retirement. I walked toward the double doors, intent on leaving this toxic life behind me instantly. But they weren't done with me yet. Daniel stepped into my path, his chest puffed out, a glass of scotch in his hand. Going somewhere, Dad? He asked, a smirk plastering his face. Not so fast. We need the keys. I stopped, looking at this 32-year-old man I had raised. The keys to what, Daniel? He laughed, glancing back at his wife, Brittany, who was watching us with hungry eyes. The credit cards. The keys to the house. Mom's lawyer said that since you are leaving the marital home, you can't take marital assets. We don't want you draining the accounts before the judge freezes them. Hand them over. I pulled out my old leather wallet. Inside there was a debit card, a corporate credit card, and about $40 in cash. I took the cash out and put it in my pocket, then slapped the wallet into Daniel's hand. Here you go. Son. You want the keys to the house? I took the heavy brass ring from my pocket and dropped them into his palm. He closed his fist around them, his eyes lighting up with greed. He thought he was holding power. In reality, he was holding an anchor. Have a nice life. Dad, Daniel laughed, kicking the car keys I tossed at his feet. Don't worry about us. We will take good care of your money. I walked out of the banquet hall and into the cool night air. The noise of the party faded behind me, replaced by the sound of traffic and the wind in the trees. I stood on the curb, a 67-year-old man with no car, no wallet, and no home. Any observer would have seen a pathetic figure, a man stripped of everything by a family of vultures. But I checked my watch. It was 8:03 p.m. A sleek black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb silently. The rear window rolled down, and a face I had trusted for 30 years looked out. It was Henry Silas, my personal attorney, and the only man who knew where the financial bodies were buried. He didn't smile. He simply unlocked the door. Get in, Stephen, Henry said. Did she do it? I slid into the leather seat, the interior smelling of expensive leather and air conditioning, sealing out the humid night and the wreckage of my family life. She did, I replied, fastening my seatbelt as the car pulled away. Serve me publicly. Daniel demanded the keys and the cards. They have possession of the physical assets. Henry nodded, tapping a command onto his tablet. And the signature? He asked. Signed, I said, leaning back and closing my eyes. The divorce is contested, but the separation date is established as of tonight. That means the trigger is active. Henry looked at me through the rearview mirror. You know what happens next. Stephen, once I hit enter, there is no going back. The protocols are irreversible. The assets in the irrevocable trust are designed to protect the principal at all costs. If the beneficiary, that's you, is compromised by a hostile legal action, the liquidity dries up, the assets freeze. It is the nuclear option. I thought about Victoria's face when she demanded the house. I thought about Chloe's followers posting my humiliation online. Do it, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Initiate Protocol Omega. Shut it all down. Cancel the secondary cards. Revoke the authorized user status. Notify the leasing companies. And send the eviction notice to the Connecticut property. Henry hit the enter key. The screen on his tablet flashed green for a second, then settled into a processing bar. It was done. The financial veins that had pumped lifeblood into my ungrateful family for decades were severed. Where to? Henry asked. Take me to the city, I said. I have a small apartment in the garment district that nobody knows about. It is under the LLC's name. It has a cot and a coffee maker. That is all I need. Tonight, I sleep like a baby. Tomorrow, the real show begins. As the car sped toward the city, I looked back at the banquet hall one last time. They were probably ordering expensive champagne, charging it to the credit card I had just handed Daniel. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, completely unaware that I had just ordered the iceberg. The next morning, the sun rose over the city with a brilliance that felt like a personal endorsement from the universe. I woke up on the stiff mattress in my secret studio apartment, my back aching slightly, but my mind clearer than it had been in decades. I made a pot of black coffee and sat by the window, looking down at the busy street. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't have to go to the office. I didn't have to check the stock market for the company. And I didn't have to listen to Victoria complain that the pool boy hadn't cleaned the filter properly. My phone, a burner prepaid model I had purchased days ago, buzzed on the small table. It was a notification from the security system at the Connecticut house. Motion detected at the front gate. I opened the app, which I still had access to as the administrator of the trust, and the camera feed loaded to show a very large, very aggressive repossession tow truck backing up to the driveway where Daniel had parked his Porsche and Chloe had parked her Range Rover. I took a sip of coffee and watched. This was scene 4 of my new life. and the script was playing out perfectly. The cars weren't owned by me, and they certainly weren't owned by my children. They were leased through a holding company under the corporate umbrella of Bennett Logistics. One of the clauses in the lease agreement, a clause I had written myself, stated that upon the termination of my employment or a change in my marital status that threatened the assets, all company vehicles were to be returned immediately to the fleet. Since I had retired and divorced in the same hour, the contracts were void. On the small screen, I saw Daniel run out of the house in his silk pajamas, waving his arms and screaming at the tow truck driver. I couldn't hear the audio through this specific camera, but I could read his body language perfectly. He was shouting, "Do you know who I am?" The driver, a burly man who clearly did not care who Daniel was, simply hooked the chains onto the Porsche's axle. Daniel tried to physically block the truck, but the driver stepped out, crossed his arms, and pointed a finger at my son. Whatever he said made Daniel step back in defeat. Then Victoria appeared, wearing a dressing gown with her hair in curlers, frantically tapping her phone screen. I knew exactly who she was trying to call. Me. But my old phone was sitting in a trash can 3 blocks from the banquet hall. But the cars were just the appetizer. The main course was arriving in exactly 1 hour. Henry Silas was sending the sheriff. While I watched the tow truck drive away with their status symbols, leaving Daniel kicking the gravel driveway like a toddler, I switched the camera feed to the kitchen interior. They were gathered around the granite island I had paid for 3 times over, looking shell-shocked. The atmosphere of self-congratulatory bliss from the night before had been replaced by panic. Gustavo, the owner of the high-end catering company that had serviced the retirement party, stood in the entryway looking uncomfortable, clutching a wireless payment terminal. I turned up the volume on my tablet. Gustavo cleared his throat and apologized for the intrusion so early in the morning, but explained that the final settlement of the bill, $25,000, was outstanding. Victoria waved a hand dismissively, pulling out the platinum card she had used to buy jewelry and designer handbags for decades. She handed it to Gustavo with the air of a queen granting a favor. The machine beeped. A sharp, dissonant sound. "Declined," Gustavo said awkwardly. Victoria laughed nervously and told him to run it again. "Declined. Account closed." Daniel stepped up, puffing out his chest, and offered his black card. "Declined." Chloe tried hers. "Declined." The financial veins had been severed completely. At 10 a.m. sharp, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up the driveway. I watched Victoria's face as she opened the massive oak double doors to find Sheriff Patterson, a man I had played poker with on Tuesdays for 10 years, standing beside Henry Silas. Henry looked like the Grim Reaper in a 3-piece charcoal suit, holding a thick leather binder. Victoria forced a smile, a reflex from her days as a society hostess. "Sheriff Patterson, is everything all right?" she asked, probably assuming I had been found in a ditch. Sheriff Patterson didn't smile back. He tipped his hat slightly. "I'm here to escort Mr. Silas, who has legal documents to serve regarding the occupancy of the premises." Victoria frowned, looking at Henry with disdain. "If this is about the divorce papers, send them to Robert Stone." She tried to close the door, but Sheriff Patterson put a hand out, stopping it firmly. "This isn't about the divorce, ma'am. It's about trespassing." Justin pushed past Victoria, trying to exert some alpha male dominance, pulling a business card from his pocket to hand to Henry. "I'm the listing agent for this estate," he declared. Henry let the card drop to the floor without even blinking. He stepped into the foyer, opened the leather binder, and spoke with a voice that was calm, dry, and utterly destructive. "You are currently in violation of criminal trespass statutes. The property located at this address is the sole asset of the Bennett Real Estate Holding Group, a subsidiary of the Bennett Family Trust. There is no listing agent because the property is not for sale." Victoria laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "This is my house. I picked out the curtains. My name is on the deed." Henry pulled a document from the binder. A single page, yellowed with age. "This is a residential lease agreement dated 25 years ago," Henry said, holding it up. Clause 7. Paragraph C stated explicitly that the lease was contingent upon the continued employment of Stephen Bennett as the trustee and the continuation of the legal marriage between the tenants. The rent was $1 a year. By filing the petition for dissolution of marriage, you voluntarily terminated the qualifying condition. You are no longer tenants, you are squatters. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward. I have an eviction order signed by Judge Whitaker this morning. The trust has declared the property at risk due to unauthorized occupants. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Justin argued that they needed 30 days, citing tenant laws. Henry corrected him with a cold smile. Since the lease is voided, the 48 hours is a courtesy, not a right. Then came the final blow. Henry looked around the foyer at the antique console table and the crystal chandelier. The eviction order applies to the structure and all fixtures and furnishings owned by the trust. The furniture, the art, the electronics, and even the silverware are cataloged assets. You may remove your personal clothing and toiletries. Everything else stays. Victoria screamed and lunged at Henry, but Sheriff Patterson intercepted her gently but firmly. Get packing, folks, the sheriff said. I'll have a deputy stationed at the gate. You have until 10 a.m. on Thursday. I watched from my studio apartment, sipping my coffee. It wasn't joy I felt, it was the satisfaction of a math problem finally solved. They had lived in a bubble of luxury, never asking who paid for the air conditioning, and now the landlord had finally come to collect. While the chaos of the eviction notice was still reverberating through the foyer, I noticed that one member of the cast was missing from the stage. Daniel hadn't stayed to comfort his mother or argue with the sheriff. Instead, he had grabbed the keys to the Porsche 911 GT3, believing that speed could put distance between him and reality. He thought he was making a strategic retreat to secure funding, unaware that he was fleeing right into my next trap. I closed the camera feed of the house and opened a new window on my tablet, ready to teach my son that you cannot drive away from a debt you owe to the universe. I watched the blue dot on my tablet screen moving rapidly east along Interstate 95. It was the GPS transponder for the Porsche 911 GT3, a car that my son, Daniel, believed was his birthright. He was currently driving at 90 miles an hour, weaving through traffic fueled by rage and the desperate need to find a new host organism. He was heading toward the estate of his father-in-law, Mr. Thomas, a man who owned a chain of car dealerships and who had always looked at me with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Daniel was going to beg for a loan, or perhaps he was going to spin a story about how his cruel father had lost his mind. I took a sip of my iced tea, sitting comfortably in the corner of a quiet bistro near the library. I wasn't worried about Daniel's safety. The car was a marvel of German engineering designed to protect the driver, even if the driver was an idiot. I was more interested in the lesson about to be delivered by the onboard computer system. You see, Daniel had always bragged to his friends that I had bought him the car for his 30th birthday. But I never buy depreciating assets. That is rule number 1 of wealth preservation. The Porsche belonged to Bennett Logistics Fleet Services, and the lease agreement had a very specific clause regarding authorized operators. Since I had retired and filed for legal separation, Daniel was now driving a stolen vehicle. I opened the fleet management app on my phone and selected the unit labeled GT3 Daniel. I tapped the menu option that said Remote Immobilization. A warning box popped up asking if I was sure. I didn't hesitate. I pressed Confirm. On the GPS map, the blue dot slowed down. I switched to the audio feed from the car's cabin, and the interior microphone picked up everything crystal clear. I heard Daniel pounding the steering wheel, screaming obscenities as the engine cut power and the car entered limp mode, restricting speed to 5 miles per hour. "Come on, you piece of junk, work!" he shouted. He dialed the number flashing on the dashboard, the 24-hour assistance line for the leasing company. "Roadside assistance. How can I help you?" A pleasant voice answered. "My car died. I'm on the highway. Fix it." Daniel yelled. "Do you know who I am? I am Daniel Bennett. This is my car." The operator paused. "Sir, The account status is listed as terminated. The vehicle has been flagged for immediate recovery. We have dispatched a flatbed to your location. Daniel went quiet. Terminated? I work for the company. I'm the vice president of special projects. I almost laughed. Special projects was a title I had invented to give him health insurance. It wasn't a real job. Sir, the operator replied, delivering the final blow. According to the file updated this morning, all employment contracts associated with the Bennett family riders have been voided. You are no longer listed as an employee. Daniel dropped the phone. He had lost his car and his job in the span of 3 minutes. The courtroom air was stale, recycled, and cold. Exactly the way I like it. But the temperature in Superior Courtroom 4B was rising rapidly thanks to the theatrical performance of Robert Stone, the shark Victoria had hired to skin me alive. Stone paced in front of Judge Whitaker's bench, gesturing wildly at me as if I were a war criminal. Your Honor, he boomed, this is a clear case of financial infidelity. Mr. Bennett has spent 40 years constructing a labyrinth of shell companies to defraud his loyal wife and children. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars vanished into thin air. We demand a full forensic audit of the Bennett Investment Trust and the immediate unfreezing of all assets. I sat at the defendant's table with Henry Silas, looking bored. Across the aisle, Victoria was putting on the performance of a lifetime, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Behind her sat Daniel and Chloe, looking like vultures waiting for a carcass. They thought Stone was winning. Judge Whitaker looked over her glasses at me. Mr. Silas, does your client have a response to these allegations of hiding assets? Henry stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, Mr. Stone is partially correct. There are millions of dollars no longer accessible to Mrs. Bennett and her children. However, the allegation that my client has hidden them is factually incorrect. Mr. Bennett hasn't hidden a dime. Henry reached under the table and pulled out a heavy banker's box, placing it on the table with a thud. The money isn't in an offshore account, Henry said, pulling out a thick bound volume. It is right here in the receipts. He handed the volume to the judge and a copy to a confused Robert Stone. This is a 10-year forensic accounting of the discretionary spending of the Bennett family. The plaintiffs claim they have been cut off from their fair share. The defense argues that they have already consumed their share with a gluttony that borders on the pathological. Henry opened the ledger. Exhibit A, Victoria Bennett. Over the last decade, Mrs. Bennett has charged exactly $2 million to the trust's primary credit lines. Couture clothing, 1. 4 millions. Jewelry, 800. Ling ling ling. And a line item for spiritual consulting, a psychic in Sedona. Totaling $000 a month. Victoria turned red as a ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. That is my money, she hissed. I am his wife? Henry ignored her and turned a page. Exhibit B, Daniel Bennett. The trust has financed 6 separate business ventures for Mr. Daniel Bennett, including a craft brewery and a cryptocurrency arbitrage firm. Total capital destroyed in failed vanity projects, 1. $5 million. This was structured as a callable debt obligation against his future inheritance. Daniel stood up, shouting, that was seed capital. Henry cut him off cold. It was a loan. And finally, Exhibit C, Chloe Bennett. Wubai, $0 in credit card debt for travel and photographers, while her influencer business reported a net income of less than $4,000 a year. The trust has been subsidizing her existence to the tune of $10,000 a month. Henry closed the book and pulled one last document from the box. This is the master charter of the Bennett Investment Trust. Clause 4. Section 9, the recoupment clause. I stood up then. It was time for me to speak. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. My father wrote that clause to ensure the family fortune would never be squandered. It states that in the event of a divorce initiated by a beneficiary spouse, any funds spent by the spouse and children in excess of the standard cost of living index, are retroactively reclassified as personal debt to the trust. Victoria gasped. She finally understood. I am not hiding assets. I said to the silent courtroom, I am calling in the loan. They don't just have nothing. Your Honor, they owe the trust $2 million. And since I am the sole trustee, I am initiating collection proceedings effective immediately. The room erupted. Victoria started screaming at Robert Stone to do something. Judge Whitaker banged her gavel. Order. This court finds the documentation provided by the defense to be substantial. The motion to freeze Mr. Bennett's personal accounts is denied. The motion for a forensic audit is denied. Counselor Stone, I suggest you advise your clients to find a way to settle their debts before this goes to bankruptcy court. Case dismissed. Stone slammed his briefcase shut and glared at Victoria. You told me he was hiding money, he hissed. You didn't tell me you spent $5 million? Find another lawyer. As I walked past my family, Victoria grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my suit jacket. Stephen, she whispered, trembling with terror. We don't have $5 million. You know we don't. I gently removed her hand. I know, Victoria. I said, that's why you need to get a job. The trust accepts monthly payments, but don't be late. The interest rate is prime plus 4%. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own greed. They had spent their future, now they had to pay for their past. The gavel had banged, but the real sentence was just beginning. As I stepped into my town car outside the courthouse, leaving them on the sidewalk with their worthless legal papers, I knew the clock had finally run out on their delusions. There were no more mansions to squat in, no more credit cards to decline, and no friends left to borrow from. Gravity is a harsh mistress when your golden parachute has been shredded, and their descent was rapid, brutal, and inevitable. They didn't land on their feet, they landed in the only place that would take cash up front and ask no questions. The downfall of the Bennett dynasty did not happen in a marble foyer or a corporate boardroom. It happened in the cramped, beige interior of the Starlight Motel on the outskirts of town, a place where the sheets smelled of bleach and regret. My private investigator sent me the audio files from the listening device Victoria had unknowingly carried in her purse. A purse she was now clutching like a lifeline because it was the only designer item she had left. They had been evicted from the estate exactly 48 hours after the sheriff arrived, forced to pack their lives into plastic garbage bags because they couldn't afford moving boxes. Now, crammed into 2 adjoining rooms with thin walls, the pressure cooker finally exploded. I sat in my quiet apartment listening to the recording, sipping a glass of water, witnessing the inevitable cannibalization of a family built on greed. It started with Justin, my son-in-law, the mediocre real estate agent who had spent 5 years treating me like his personal bank teller. He had been on his phone for hours trying to find a loophole, a hidden account, or anything that would salvage his financial future. But he found nothing. What he found instead was the truth about his wife. I heard his voice on the recording, shrill and panicked, screaming at Chloe. Where is the trust fund? Chloe? You said you had millions. You said we were set for life. Chloe was sobbing, admitting she had lied to get him to propose, admitting that her entire net worth was tied to a credit card that was now cut in half on a motel nightstand. The sound of a suitcase zipper cut through the argument. Justin wasn't staying to work it out. He was checking out. I'm filing for an annulment based on fraud, he spat out. You're a parasite, just like your mother. The door slammed, leaving Chloe wailing in a room that cost $40 a night. The sound of a woman realizing her beauty and her followers meant nothing when the rent was due. But while Chloe's life was imploding in room 102, a far more dangerous plan was hatching in room 104. Daniel and Brittany were sitting on the edge of a stained mattress, staring at a vending machine dinner they couldn't stomach. Brittany was the catalyst, a woman who believed the world owed her a living simply for existing. I heard her voice, low and venomous, whispering to Daniel. She told him that I was evil, that I had stolen their birthright, twisting reality until Daniel was the victim of grand theft, rather than the beneficiary of decades of generosity. Then she pitched her idea. She reminded Daniel about the overflow warehouse at Bennett Logistics, a facility I had managed for 20 years that housed high-value electronics and luxury goods. "It's your father's company," Brittany hissed. "That means it's yours. Go there. Take a truckload. We can fence the goods in the city and get enough cash to hire a real lawyer to fight the trust." Daniel hesitated, the fear evident in his voice. "I don't have a key," he stammered. "Security is tight," Brittany mocked him, questioning his manhood. "Are you going to let your father starve us to death? Are you a man or a child?" She manipulated him with the skill of a surgeon, cutting away his conscience until only his desperation remained. Around 2 a.m., my phone alerted me. It wasn't a call, it was a notification from the security grid at the Bennett Logistics warehouse. "Perimeter breach. Sector Patru." I opened the camera feed. The video was grainy night vision, but the figure was unmistakable. It was Daniel, wearing a dark hoodie, trying to pry open a side door with a crowbar. He looked terrified and clumsy, trying to break into a fortress I had spent 40 years fortifying. He managed to pop the lock on an old service entrance and slipped inside, completely unaware that the moment he breached the perimeter, the silent alarm had tripped. He didn't know that the warehouse was equipped with a pressure-sensitive floor system that tracked his every movement. And he certainly didn't know that the security contract I had signed years ago guaranteed a police response time of under 4 minutes. I watched the screen as blue and red lights flashed silently against the warehouse windows. Daniel didn't notice until it was too late. He turned a corner carrying a duffel bag full of stolen iPads and walked straight into a wall of tactical lights. "Police, get on the ground!" I saw my son drop the bag and raise his hands. I saw him shoved against the concrete floor, his face pressed into the dust. He was crying, screaming that his name was Bennett, that he owned the place. But the officer didn't care. They cuffed him and dragged him out to the cruiser, a thief caught in the act, stealing from the legacy he was too lazy to build. My phone rang at 3:30 a.m. It was Victoria. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Victoria," I said calmly. She didn't say hello, she screamed. "You monster! You let them arrest him. You knew, you saw it, and you did nothing." I stayed silent, letting her pour her venom into the receiver. "Brittany called me," she sobbed. "Daniel is in central lockup. They charged him with grand larceny and breaking and entering. He faces 5 years. "Stephen, 5 years? He is your son. How could you let this happen? You could have dropped the charges." I took a slow breath. The entitlement was breathtaking. "Victoria," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I didn't make him break into a warehouse. I didn't hand him a crowbar. Men make choices, and tonight he chose to become a criminal." "Fix it," she demanded. "Call the police chief. Tell him it was a misunderstanding." "No," I interrupted. "You wanted freedom. Freedom includes the liberty to fail. It includes the obligation to face the consequences of your own stupidity. Daniel is free now, free to navigate the legal system. But he's your son," she whimpered. "Tonight, he isn't my son," I replied. "Tonight, he is a burglar who broke into a corporate facility owned by the trust. And the trust presses charges." I hung up the phone. I didn't block the number. I wanted her to realize that the silence on my end was a choice, not an error. Daniel pleaded down to a lesser charge to avoid a long prison sentence, but he still served time, and the felony theft charge remained on his record. They were finally, completely on their own. While they spent 6 months learning the harsh geometry of rock bottom, I was preparing my final public statement. It was time to return to the world they thought they owned. The Oakwood Country Club was a fortress of old money and new gossip, a place where reputations were currency and exclusion was a blood sport. For 30 years, I had walked these manicured grounds as a shadow. I was Victoria's husband, the wallet with legs, the man who held her purse while she drank vodka tonics with women who despised her. But today, I did not walk in through the side entrance. I drove my black Lincoln right up to the portico. The valet, a young man named Jimmy, who had parked my Ford hundreds of times without making eye contact, scrambled to open my door. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had. "Good afternoon, Muster Bennett," Jimmy stammered, his eyes widening as he took in my bespoke tuxedo. "Or should I say, Mr. Chairman?" I handed him a $100 bill. "Chairman sounds fine." "Jimmy, keep it close." I walked into the grand ballroom, the same room where Victoria had planned her 50th birthday party, a gala that had cost me 6 figures and where I wasn't even allowed to give a toast. Today, the room was set for the annual charity gala, the highlight of the social season. This was the event Victoria lived for, but her name had been scrubbed from the guest list at 9 a.m. that morning. I adjusted my cuffs and stepped into the room. The conversation didn't stop, but it shifted. I saw the eyes of Victoria's circle, the viper pit she called her best friends. There was Martha, a woman who had once told Victoria in front of me that I lacked ambition. She approached me like a predator sensing a shift in the wind. "Stephen," she cooed, reaching out a hand adorned with diamonds that were likely leased. We were so shocked to hear about the restructuring. "Is Victoria all right? We haven't heard from her." I held her hand for a second too long, forcing her to look at me. "Victoria is finding her own path, Martha," I said, my voice projecting just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "She always wanted independence. I simply gave her the opportunity to experience it fully." Before she could respond, Mr. Vanderbilt, the club president, tapped his glass. He introduced me, not as the boring accountant, but as the club's new honorary chairman of the philanthropic board. I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces that had ignored me for decades. "Thank you, everyone," I said into the microphone. "For years, my family has enjoyed the hospitality of this club. Tonight, I wanted to give something back." I signaled to the assistants, who brought out a large, oversized presentation check. During the legal proceedings of the last 6 months, a certain sum of money was demanded for a divorce settlement to maintain a lifestyle that no longer exists. Since that settlement is no longer legally required, I found myself with a surplus of liquidity. I gestured to the check. The number was written in bold black ink, $5 million. Tonight, the Bennett Investment Trust is donating $5 million to the Urban Youth Entrepreneurship Program. This money will help young people build their own businesses so they never have to rely on anyone else to survive. The room gasped. It was exactly the amount Victoria had demanded for her freedom. I looked directly at the camera lens of the videographer. Giving people money they didn't earn doesn't help them. It destroys them. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that drowned out the ghosts of my marriage. I had just burned Victoria's golden parachute on live television. 6 months is a long time in the world of high finance, but it is an eternity in the world of minimum wage labor. While I accepted congratulations, my private investigator sent me a new batch of surveillance files. The first video showed a woman standing behind Register 4 at a Walmart supercenter on the edge of town. It was Victoria. The woman who had thrown a divorce petition onto a cake was now scanning a 50-pound bag of dog food. Her hair, once dyed a perfect honey blonde, was now showing inch-long roots of steel gray. I watched as Susan, one of Victoria's old tennis partners, approached the register with a cart full of party supplies. Victoria froze, trying to hide behind the screen, but there was nowhere to go. Susan didn't say hello. She simply handed Victoria a coupon. Victoria took it, her hand trembling, scanned it, and handed Susan the receipt. The humiliation was absolute. The next file showed Chloe standing at a pawn shop counter, arguing with a man behind bulletproof glass. On the counter sat a Hermes Birkin bag, a graduation gift I had purchased for $12,000. Chloe was pleading, telling the broker it was an investment piece, but he only offered her $800. She screamed, stormed out, checked her phone, and then walked back in to take the cash. She had been evicted from 3 apartments and was now subletting a basement room. And then there was Daniel, my son, the former vice president, was sitting in a park eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, his hands stained with paint and dirt. He had finally found work as a day laborer on a construction crew, hauling sheetrock up 4 flights of stairs for $12 an hour because no respectable firm would hire a felon. That evening, the three of them converged in the cramped living room of the small 2-bedroom apartment. Victoria had managed to rent with her wages and a co-signer I didn't recognize. I tapped into the audio feed from the listening device my investigator had planted behind the radiator. They were eating takeout pizza, the grease soaking through the cardboard box. "This isn't working," Victoria rasped, her voice thick with smoke from cheap cigarettes. "I can't do the standing anymore. My veins are popping." And seeing Susan today, she looked at me like I was the help. Daniel snapped back. "I am the help, Mom. I spent 8 hours sanding a floor today. My hands are bleeding." But then, the conversation shifted from misery to strategy. "He has to be lonely," Victoria said quietly. "He's 67. He's living in that apartment all by himself. He wants to be the patriarch, the wise old man who guides the wayward children. He's waiting for us to beg." "You think so?" Chloe asked, looking up from her cracked phone screen. "You think if we apologize, he'll open the trust back up?" Victoria nodded, the ghost of her old manipulative self reawakening. "We go tomorrow. I found his address. We go there, we cry, and we tell him we miss him. We play the part. We tell him we've learned the value of $1. Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll tell him the construction job changed me. He loves that grit stuff." I listened to them plotting, constructing a script based on a version of me that no longer existed. They thought my cutting them off was a tantrum, a temporary punishment that could be ended with a few magic words. They were preparing a heist, not an apology. I turned off the audio feed and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Sam," I said, dialing Henry Silas. "Prepare the paperwork. The employment contracts, the liability waivers, in 3 uniforms. They want back in? I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for. They think they're coming to a family reunion, but they are walking into a job interview." The following afternoon, the trap was primed. I stood waiting, not as the lonely patriarch they imagined, but as the CEO of their rude awakening. They thought they were ascending to salvation, but the lift was carrying them straight to Judgment Day. The elevator that services the penthouse of the Pinnacle does not have buttons. It has a biometric scanner and moves with the silence of a predator stalking its prey. I stood in the center of my foyer, waiting for the doors to slide open. I had leaked my address to a mutual acquaintance, knowing it would reach Victoria within the hour. They expected to find me in a sad assisted living facility, perhaps a 1-bedroom apartment with beige walls and the smell of boiled cabbage. They expected to find a broken man staring at a television set, waiting to die. When the polished steel doors parted, however, they did not step into a nursing home. They stepped onto Italian marble imported from a quarry in Carrara. They stepped into a space with 20-foot ceilings and a panoramic view of Lake Michigan that stretched all the way to the horizon. The late afternoon sun flooded the apartment, turning the dust motes into gold, illuminating the stark contrast between their reality and mine. I watched them freeze. It was a tableau of calculated humility. Victoria was wearing a gray wool coat that looked 3 sizes too big, a garment she had likely pulled from the back of a closet she hadn't opened since the 90s. She wore no jewelry, not even a watch. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing the age she had spent a fortune trying to hide. Behind her stood Daniel and Chloe. They were dressed in what I can only describe as poverty cosplay. Daniel wore a flannel shirt and work boots that looked scuffed, not from labor, but from sandpaper. Chloe wore a simple cotton dress and flat shoes, her hair tied back in a severe bun. They looked like refugees from a period drama. They had come dressed for a funeral. The funeral of my pride. Victoria was the first to recover. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the grand piano, the abstract sculptures, and the sheer expense of the square footage. I could see the calculator running behind her eyes. She was realizing that while she was scanning dog food, I was living in a fortress of solitude that cost more per month than she used to spend in a year. "Stephen," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. "We didn't know. We thought you were suffering." I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, wearing a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply observed. "Hello, Victoria," I said. "I see you found the place." She took a step forward, her hands reaching out as if to touch a holy relic. "We came because we couldn't sleep," she said. "The guilt, Stephen, it has been eating us alive. We realized how wrong we were. We realized that money is poison." It was a good line. Daniel stepped up next to her and dropped to his knees. He actually dropped to his knees on the marble floor. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I was an idiot. I was blind. That job, the construction job, it taught me. It broke me down. Dad, I know what it means to work now. I just want my father back." Chloe joined him, kneeling beside her brother. "I miss you. Daddy," she sobbed. "I don't care about the bags. I don't care about the followers. I just want to sit and have dinner with you again." I looked at them. 3 actors on a stage, performing for an audience of 1. If I hadn't listened to their conversation the night before, I might have been moved. I might have believed that the hardship had cracked their shells and let some light in. But I knew better. I knew this was a heist. They weren't here for forgiveness. They were here for the combination to the safe. "Stand up," I said, my voice neutral. "You are making a scene, and I just had the floors polished. Come in. Sit down." They scrambled to their feet, hope flaring in their eyes like a match in a dark room. They walked into the sunken living room, treading softly as if afraid to wake a sleeping beast. I walked to the sidebar, poured a pitcher of water, and placed 4 glasses on the coffee table. In the center of the table, sitting alone on the glass surface, was a thick navy blue legal folder, bound with a gold elastic cord. The label on the front was typed in bold serif font, "Bennett Investment Trust Reorganization and Reinstatement Protocol." I saw Victoria's eyes lock onto the folder. She stopped breathing for a second. To them, that folder wasn't paper. It was a time machine. It was a ticket back to the country club, back to the Porsche, back to the life where consequences were things that happened to other people. "I am glad to hear that you have learned," I said, tapping the cover of the dossier, "because I have been doing a lot of thinking too. I realized that perhaps I was too harsh. You needed structure. You needed a path back." "Yes," Daniel said eagerly. "A path. That's all we want. A chance to prove ourselves." I opened the folder. Inside were 3 distinct stacks of paper, crisp and white. "This document represents a new beginning," I lied smoothly. "It provides financial security. It provides purpose. And most importantly, it restores the family connection." I separated the stacks. I slid one toward Victoria, one toward Daniel, and one toward Chloe. "But," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "there are conditions. This is not a handout. This is an agreement. You said you wanted to earn your way back. You said you understood the value of work." "Yes, yes," Victoria said, reaching for the pen. "Anything, Stephen." They didn't read it. They didn't even look at the headers. They saw the Bennett Trust logo at the top and grabbed the pens I had placed on the table. They signed their names with a speed that spoke of desperation. When they were finished, Victoria handed the papers back to me with a smile that was almost genuine because she truly believed she had won. "Thank you, Stephen," she said. "You won't regret this." I checked the signatures. Valid. Binding. Irrevocable. I smiled then. A cold, sharp smile that finally reached my eyes. "No, Victoria," I said, standing up and closing the folder. "I don't think I will." I walked to the intercom on the wall and pressed a button. "Henry," Bring the uniforms. The door to the study opened, and Henry Silas walked in carrying 3 bundles of gray fabric wrapped in plastic. He placed them on the coffee table. Uniforms? Daniel asked, his smile faltering. I picked up the document Victoria had just signed. Welcome back to the company, I said. You just signed standard employment contracts for the Bennett Logistics Distribution Center. Entry level. Daniel, you signed on as a material handler. Level 1. That means loading trucks. Victoria, you are part of the sanitation and maintenance crew. Night shift. And Chloe, you are in inventory data entry in the sub-basement. No phones allowed. Victoria stood up, her face turning purple. What is this? Is this a joke? I held up the contract. Clause 1. Employment is at will, but acceptance of this position is a prerequisite for any future consideration regarding trust beneficiary status. You said you wanted to work. Victoria. The pay is minimum wage, but the benefits package is excellent after 90 days. You can't be serious, she screamed. I am not a janitor. You are now, I said, or you can leave. But if you walk out that door, you violate the contract you just signed, and the door to this family closes forever. Suddenly, the elevator doors slid open again. Brittany stormed in. She had been waiting in the lobby, refusing to kneel with the others. She saw the uniforms. She saw Daniel holding the work boots. Where is the money? Daniel? She shrieked. Why are you holding a janitor's uniform? Daniel looked at his wife, tired and hungry. We have jobs. Brittany. Dad gave us jobs. Brittany laughed. A grell, mocking sound. Jobs? You think I married you to date a warehouse loader? You are a loser. Daniel. And your father is a psycho. She turned on her heel. I am leaving. And Daniel, if you sign that W-4, don't bother coming back to the motel. We are done. The doors closed, sealing her out of our lives. Daniel slumped his shoulders. He was stripped bare. He looked at the pen, then at me. Sign the tax form, Daniel, I said softly. The cafeteria at the warehouse serves hot meals. Employee discount, shaking. Daniel signed. He chose food over pride. Chloe cried, but she signed too. Only Victoria remained obstinate. I cannot scrub floors. Stephen, she pleaded, dropping the act. I am 60 years old. Then, the library door opened. Isabella walked into the room. She was tall, elegant, wearing a simple cashmere wrap and holding a book. She didn't look at Victoria with pity, but with calm intellectual curiosity. She walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of intimacy and equality. Victoria looked at Isabella, then at herself in the window reflection. Old, tired, wearing ill-fitting clothes. She realized she hadn't just lost the money, she had lost the man to someone who loved him for his mind, not his wallet. The realization broke her. Her shoulders collapsed. She reached for the pen and signed the contract for the sanitation crew. Report to Quanduck O'Brien at 0600 hours tomorrow, I said. Don't be late. The bus schedule is tight. I handed them the gray uniforms, and they took them like prisoners taking their stripes. They turned and walked toward the elevator, a procession of the defeated, heading towards the only thing that could save them, hard work. With the contract signed and my family officially employed, I left the cold gray reality of New Jersey behind. I had balanced the ledger, and now it was time to enjoy the profit. 6 months later, the view from my window was finally perfect. The sunlight in Tuscany hits the grapevines differently than it does anywhere else on Earth. It is a soft, golden light that seems to slow down time itself, making the afternoon stretch into an eternity of warmth and peace. I sat on the stone terrace of a villa outside of Florence, a glass of vintage Chianti in my hand, watching the wind ripple through the olive trees. Isabella was sitting across from me, reading a book of Italian poetry aloud, her voice blending harmoniously with the chirping of the cicadas. We had spent the morning walking through a vineyard, discussing history and art, and the only decision I had to make was whether to have the pasta or the fish for dinner. For the first time in 40 years, my shoulders were not tight. The constant hum of anxiety, the background noise of managing a family that resented me, had finally gone silent. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like earth and history. It tasted like freedom. 4,000 miles away, in the concrete belly of the Bennett Logistics Distribution Center in New Jersey, the atmosphere was very different. I opened my laptop, not to work, but to check in. I had set a reminder on my calendar, 6-month review. I pulled up the live security feeds using the encrypted administrator access I had retained. Camera 4 showed the loading dock at 4:30 a.m. local time. It was raining, a cold, sleeting rain that turned the asphalt into a slick gray mirror. My son, Daniel, was there. He was wearing the gray uniform I had given him, but it was no longer crisp. It was stained with grease and sweat. He was wearing a yellow safety vest and steel-toed boots that looked heavy on his feet. He was wrestling with a pallet jack, trying to move a skid of industrial auto parts that weighed 500 pounds. He was slipping. He was struggling. Quinn Duck O'Brien, a man who took no prisoners, was standing nearby, checking a clipboard, likely shouting about the schedule. I watched my son's face, and it was a revelation. The arrogance was gone. The sneer that used to appear whenever I asked him about his job search had been sanded away by 6 months of physical labor. He gritted his teeth, dug his heels into the wet concrete, and pushed. He put his shoulder into the weight and forced the pallet up the ramp. He didn't complain. He didn't call his mother. He just worked. I switched the feed to the sub-basement archive division, a windowless room illuminated by the buzz of fluorescent tube lights. Chloe was sitting at a small metal desk surrounded by stacks of shipping manifests from the 90s. Her job was to digitize them, keystroke by keystroke. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wasn't looking at a phone because phones were strictly prohibited in the secure archive. She was staring at a monitor, her fingers flying across the number pad. 10 hours a day. No likes. No comments. No filters. Just raw data. I saw her pause to rub her wrists, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath before diving back into the work. She had learned focus. She had learned that the world does not applaud you simply for existing. You have to produce. Finally, I opened the feed for the sanitation department break room. Victoria was sitting alone at a round laminate table, wearing her gray jumpsuit and a hairnet. She was eating a sandwich wrapped in foil, chewing slowly. When she finished, she walked over to the sink, washed her hands, and checked her reflection in the paper towel dispenser. She straightened her collar and adjusted her name tag. She picked up her mop bucket with a strange, grim dignity. The woman who used to fire maids for leaving a streak on the mirror was now cleaning mirrors for minimum wage, and she was doing it well. I looked away from the screen and back at the Tuscan landscape. Isabella reached across the table and touched my hand. "Where did you go just now?" she asked softly. I looked at her, realizing how lucky I was to have found someone who valued the man, not the bank account. "I went to the office," I said, "just checking on the new hires. How are they doing?" she asked, knowing the whole story. "They are surviving," I said. "They are learning. For 40 years, I gave them money and they gave me contempt. Now, I am giving them nothing but opportunity. And for the first time in their lives, they are becoming people I could almost respect." I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had evaporated, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. I had saved them from their own uselessness by giving them the privilege of struggle. I closed the laptop lid with a soft click. The image of my struggling family disappeared, replaced by the reflection of a man who was finally free. Later that evening, I sat at the antique oak desk in the study of the villa to write in my journal. I uncapped my fountain pen, the same Mont Blanc I had used to sign the divorce papers. "I am not retired," I wrote, underlining the words. "That is the greatest lie," I told them. "A man like me never retires. We just change projects." My previous project was the maintenance of a parasitic family unit. That project was a failure, so I liquidated it. My new project is my own life. I closed the journal and walked out to the converted stable garage. In the center sat a 1,967 Austin Healey, 3,000 inches British racing green. It was loud, dangerous, and magnificent. Everything Victoria had forbidden me to own. Isabella appeared in the doorway, wearing a silk scarf and big sunglasses, looking like a movie star. "Where are we going?" she shouted over the roar of the engine as I turned the key. "I don't know," I shouted back, smiling. "Does it matter?" She laughed and shook her head. "No, Stephen, it doesn't matter at all." I shifted gears, and we rolled out onto the winding road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there for me anymore. I drove into the sunset, the engine singing a song of redemption, finally exactly where I belonged. In the driver's seat,